Hello, I'm Mark Brosnon from the Centre of Applied Autism Research at the University of Bath. And today I'm talking about cyber-dependent crime. It's work that I've conducted with the colleagues that you can see listed here. The work has been funded by Barclays Bank as well as the National Crime Agency. And in the UK, the National Crime Agency are the police body who sit above local agencies akin to the FBI in the United States. So taking a big perspective about cybercrime, the World Economic Forum asked companies all over the world what they perceive to be the greatest risk in 2020. And you can see from this graph here, along the bottom you have the likelihood of the event, and up the other side you have the impact of the event. And of course, global environmental issues feature heavily in that top right-hand corner. And right in there are cyber attacks. It's one of the most highest likely as well as the most impactful threats that companies are seeking currently. And in terms of quantifying that, companies are suggesting, obviously estimates differ, but is around $6 trillion expected to be lost through cybercrime this year. And this is ever increasing. And by 2025, this is estimated to be about $10.5 trillion are going to be lost through cybercrime. So it's a major issue. And the NCA have looked at, well, what are some of the precursors or the risk factors associated with cyber criminality? And you can see the highlighted one here that we're going to focus on today is the NCA have stated autism spectrum disorder appears to be more prevalent amongst cyber criminals than the general populace, though this remains unproven. So that's the state of affairs here in the UK. And this is compounded by a series of very high-profile hacking stories where the hackers are autistic and they're taking autistic identity, and some are using the autistic identity as a reason not to get extradited to the USA. And it's a small number, but it's a very high profile number of cyber hackers who are autistic. So this all adds to the general conception that autism is associated with cyber dependent crime. So we have anecdotal accounts that autism is associated with cybercrime. But this is actually quite challenging when you look at the research literature looking at autism and crime generally. Autistic employees are generally regarded as trustworthy, loyal, and reliable. And also a great deal of research has showed that autistic people are generally law-abiding with low rates of criminality. So this sense of autism being associated with cybercrime doesn't sit with a great deal of research that's previously been conducted looking at the relationship between autism and crime generally. So to explore this, we've looked at what exactly cybercrime means. And you can see the top definition there is cybercrime is the illegal use of computers and the internet, or crime committed by means of computers and the internet. And there's a major distinction that's been made within the world of cybercrime, and that's between cyber-dependent crime and cyber-enabled crime. Now, cyber-dependent crime is what we're focusing on today, and these are offences that can only be committed by using computer technology. So these are crimes such as hacking or distributed denial of service or DDoSing, where you totally flood a server so that it becomes unfunctionable. And this is distinct from cyber-enabled crimes, which are traditional crimes such as fraud. So you could conduct fraud via online mechanisms, but essentially that is the crime of fraud. And were you to be prosecuted, you'll be prosecuted for fraud. Whereas with cyber-dependent crimes, you're prosecuted in the UK, it's the Computer Misuse Act, and these are across the world specific laws that have been created to prosecute people who commit cyber-dependent crimes. And that's what we're focusing on, crimes that can only be used with computer technology, such as hacking and DDoSing. So there's the first study that looked at the association between autism and cybercrime, and pretty much still the only one really, was by Ledingham and Mills. And they interviewed 7 national law enforcement agencies, such as the NCA and the FBI, but looking across the globe to see what their perceptions of autism and cybercrime were. And they found that globally, law enforcement agencies were reporting a growing number of investigations that were focused upon autistic individuals. And what Ledingham and Mills did was explore this and found that the law enforcement agencies were reporting autistic-like people appearing with high occurrence in their investigations. But actually, the prevalence rates and the data weren't actually there. So again, it was adding to that anecdotal account of there being a perceived link between autism and cybercrime, but very little evidence to actually substantiate that claim. So how might we tie these potentially contradictory ideas together of a perceived association between autism and cybercrime, whereas evidence from the research suggesting that autistic people generally are quite law-abiding, more in fact than the general population? And one explanatory framework we're going to explore today is the sense of autistic-like traits and how that might relate to cybercrime. So what are autistic-like traits? And autistic-like traits are argued to be this dimensional characteristic of human difference that focus on these 5 key areas here when they're measured by one of the measures, or they're called the AQ, or the autism quotient. But there are other measures of autistic traits too. And these are key facets of human functioning along the lines of social skills, as well as attention to detail and attention switching, and communication skills and imagination skills. And some examples are given in the little table here. Now, autistic people tend to be higher in autistic-like traits. But as I say, autistic-like traits are dimensional and span the entire population. And in the UK, our National Health Service use a short version of the autistic spectrum quotient, or the AQ, just a 10-item version, as a screener for autism. And that example is given here. So questions like, I find it easy to work out what someone is thinking or feeling just by looking at their face, would be one that is a counterbalanced example. Or I find it difficult to work out people's intentions isn't counterbalanced. So you can see from these 10 questions where people lie on the autism traits continuum. So the reason it's not diagnostic is because there are overlaps between the autistic and the non-autistic populations in their levels of autistic-like traits. So in this graph here that comes from Baron Cohen's research in Cambridge, you can see the right-hand solid line curve is the autistic-like traits levels of autistic populations, averaging around 40 or so, whereas the non-autistic in the dotted line here on the left-hand side is averaging around 20 in terms of autistic traits, ranging from 0 to a possible top score of 50. But crucially, these two distributions overlap with each other. So you might not be autistic and have high levels of autistic traits, and there are also some autistic people with lower levels of autistic traits. So taken as a whole, autistic people have higher levels of autistic traits than non-autistic people, but this is a dimensional approach of thinking about autistic traits. So these two distributions overlap with each other. So again, looking at the Cambridge research, looking at what might autistic-like traits relate to, and autistic-like traits relate to an interest in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or in the UK, we call these STEM subjects. And people with high levels of autistic-like traits have been found to be highly represented in STEM-like subjects, as have autistic people within higher education, for example, have been found to be drawn and be overrepresented within STEM subjects. Conversely, people with low levels of autistic-like traits from that continuum have been found to be very highly represented within sales types occupations, where you need a lot of kind of social skills to be able to sway people to purchase whatever it is you're selling. So there does seem to be a relationship between occupation and study and autistic traits, and an orient or high levels of autistic traits and an orientation towards science and technology. So how might all these feed in then back to our sense of cybercrime? So we're looking at this potential link. Maybe it's autistic-like traits. This is the risk factor for cybercrime. And we might hypothesize that there's a direct link, although as we mentioned earlier, this might contribute, not contribute, but be inconsistent with that literature from autism that shows that autistic people tend to be less likely to commit crime, if anything. But there might also be an indirect link then, potentially, between higher levels of autistic-like traits relating to an interest in science and technology, and therefore a greater propensity to develop the technological and the programming skills required to engage in cybercrime. If you look through the literature as well, looking at potential risks of cybercrime, lower social support is also flagged up as a potential risk factor, as is compromised explicit social cognition, such as theory of mind, and potentially not being able to think through the consequences of criminal activity upon victims. So when you look at particularly the psychological literature of cybercrime, these are the potential risk factors. So now I'm going to tell you about a study where we looked at this potential relationship between autism, autistic-like traits, and these risk factors for cyber-dependent crime. And it was an online survey which had 290 participants that were recruited from schools and universities and the general populations to look at three core areas and how they might relate to each other. The kind of basic demographics, the key psychological variables, and the computer-related experience. So in terms of the demographics of who completed this online questionnaire, you can see there was a disproportionately number of males compared to females. On average, they were around 24 years of age. And we also did a brief Raven's matrix of just 12 items, and on average are scoring 10. So a fairly high IQ, around 24, with more males than females characterized what I'm about to say. So that will limit the generalization. In terms of the psychological variables, the autistic traits were measured using the AQ, that's Baron-Cohen's measure of the autism spectrum quotient. There was also an informal test of social know-how developed by Dewey, which is a measure of theory of mind, really, and explicit social cognition, and also the ICEL, which is a measure of perceived social support. And you can see the norms there for the overall groups. In addition, computer-related experience was assessed, three aspects of that: very basic computer-dependent skills, such as how to download files, as an example, as well as advanced computer-dependent skills that would be required to undertake cyber hacking or DDoSing and this cyber criminal activity, as well as asking people had they engaged in computer-dependent criminal activities. And the questionnaire was anonymous and confidential and had been through all the appropriate ethical channels. So of those who had committed cyber crimes, we asked them what cyber crimes they had committed, and you can see the list here. The different types of cyber-dependent crimes, and hacking and DDoSing were the two most common, but you can see what other kind of cyber-dependent crimes were being reported. And what the study sought to do was compare those who had committed cyber-dependent crime with those who hadn't committed cyber crime, with the proviso that this is all self-reported online data. So when we compare the 122 people who had self-reported they had committed one or more cyber-dependent criminal activities with those who hadn't committed cyber-dependent crime, you can see there was many of the variables where there were no differences between these two groups. But the first difference between the groups I'd like to draw your attention to is that of autistic-like traits. Those who had committed cyber-dependent crime were significantly higher in autistic traits than those who had not committed cyber-dependent crime. The next key difference was in digital skills. Those who committed cybercrime had significantly greater digital skills than those who had not committed cybercrime. And the third and final one I'd like to draw your attention to is the presence of a diagnosis of autism. And those who had a diagnosis of autism were significantly less likely to have committed cybercrime than those who did not have a diagnosis of autism. So putting all these factors together into a mediation analysis, there was a direct association of autistic-like traits with cyber-dependent criminal activity. And in addition to that, there was an indirect effect of autistic-like traits being mediated by advanced digital skills that then went on to increase the likelihood of engaging in cyber-dependent criminal activity. So this model accounted for around 40% of the variance. So a direct effect of higher autistic-like traits, as well as an indirect effect mediated by advanced digital skills on an increased likelihood of committing cyber-dependent crime. So what are the implications of these findings for autism? So to recap, autistic-like traits are associated directly with cyber-dependent criminal activity. In addition to that, autistic-like traits are associated indirectly through the mediation of advanced digital skills. And you'll recall from earlier on that autistic people are typically have higher levels of autistic-like traits as measured by the AQ. But you'll also remember that autism was associated with not committing cyber-dependent crime. So that does match the earlier data looking at autistic people and their propensity to engage less in crime than the general population. So taking these together, high autistic traits without a diagnosis of autism seem to be what related to higher levels of cyber-dependent crime. However, high levels of autistic traits with autism may be related to associating with a skill set of IT-related skills that are useful for the cyber industry, but also a predisposition to not engaging in cybercrime. So this might well be ideal profile example if you're looking for people to fill the numerous vacancies within the cybersecurity type arena. So again, thank you to our funders, and the contact details are here of our co-workers. So Katie Louise Payne led on a lot of this work, supervised by myself and Katie Morass and Elsa Russell. We also had Richard Mills from Research Autism, Indira Ajray from the University of Bristol. There are some additional resources. So there's the chapter in the Autism in the Law book, as well as Katie Louise's Payne's paper that focused directly on this research. And if you look her up, she has also written some other papers on the relationship with different types of crime as well. So there's some additional resources for you there. And I shall finish there. Thank you for listening.